Hello, I'm Dr Manjir and welcome to Hidden Science. This week we'll be looking at what doctors don't tell you and the balance of reporting of science in medicine. With me in the studio are Lynn McTaggart and her husband, Brian Hubbard, who together publish What Doctors Don't Tell You, the magazine. We'll also be joined by Dr Robert Verkerk, who's the Scientific Director of the Alliance of Natural Health. Now, the People's Voice was set up to bring balance to the media when the mainstream press are reporting an issue in an imbalanced way. And there have been very few cases that are quite as extreme as the one we're discussing in this show. So my first guest is Lynn McTaggart, an investigative journalist, an author and sought-after public speaker. She's the author of many best-selling books, including The Field, The Intentional Experiments, What Doctors Don't Tell You, and she's also an accomplished broadcaster who's appeared on many national TV and radio shows, including Oprah Winfrey. Welcome to the show, Lynn.
Thank you very much, Manjir.
Now, could you tell us a bit about what's been going on in terms of the magazine, which we have a copy here?
Well, we've been running What Doctors Don't Tell You as a newsletter since 1989. And in September 2012, we decided to turn it into a newsstand magazine. And from the moment of its inception, we were the target of an attack by an industry-sponsored organization, Sense About Science. And they contacted every store that every chain that we're in, from W.H. Smith to Sainsbury's, etc., and attempted to get us off the shelves. They've tried to attack all of our advertising, and they've just had a prolonged campaign to try to shut us down. And that erupted again this autumn when they persuaded the Times to run an article allegedly claiming that there were doctors and scientists wanting to ban our magazine. And it ran not once but twice in October and November.
Now, in all of this time, did the Times actually contact you at all to get your opinion?
In the first story, no. They claimed that they tried to get hold of us, but we only later, 3 days after the story ran, found that they'd phoned our accounts department. And that's manned once a week by our accounts people. And at no point did they, solicit our comment, nor did they allow us to correct their completely inaccurate story.
And who is it exactly who's going for this? Who is this group? Is there a particular group of scientists?
It's a self-styled organization called Sense About Science that is funded, sponsored by the pharmaceutical industry and other organizations, and feels its job is to maintain mainstream science. And it spends most of its time, even though it's supposedly a charity, it spends most of its time doing very uncharitable things like attacking alternative practitioners or attacking people who have an alternative point of view. And they are particularly disturbed about things that go on about alternative and natural forms of healthcare.
But surely, I mean, you've got a publication that the public are buying, presumably. I mean, it's a successful publication that's been going for quite a long time. Isn't this what the public wants?
Well, it is what the public wants. That's what the whole issue actually is, and I think what the Times doesn't understand. There is such an enormous body of people out there who unabashedly want natural health care. And I think this kind of idea and this kind of representation is a small group, but funded by one of the most profitable industries in the world. So we're talking about a small group trying to sort of lead this charge against us, with a lot of unsavory trolls and people like that who seem to work in concert and crawl all over our Facebook pages, etc. But in actual fact, the reason this is going on is because more and more and more people are abandoning conventional medicine and seeking alternatives because conventional medicine in the main doesn't work and is a dirty, dirty industry.
Now that's quite a strong statement that you've made there, of that conventional medicine doesn't work. I mean, what do you mean? I mean, we've had evidence-based medicine for quite a long time. I mean,
Okay, well, look at three just statistics. First of all, heads of medicine, people like Peter Ghosh, who run the Danish Cochrane, the Scandinavian Cochrane collaboration, and was one of the people founding the Cochrane collaboration. So one of the guys behind evidence-based medicine some years ago.
Yes, very well known.
He has written a book now called Deadly Medicine and Organized Crime, and he has compared the compared the pharmaceutical industry to the mafia. So the problem is that medicine, first of all, is dirty. Most of the studies, as Cochrane says, as Gosch says, as many other heads like Richard Smith who used to be the editor of the British Medical Journal say, are basically tainted. They're fraudulent. They're made up or massaged or manipulated by the pharmaceutical industry and PR people that they work with. So there's issues around how this material is created. Secondly, the British Medical Journal itself says that mainstream medicine has been demonstrated to work about 12% of the time, that there's adequate evidence to show the stuff works. And thirdly, medicine is the third leading cause of death in the West now. It's the only ones that are more likely to kill you are heart disease and cancer. So there's a lot of issues with conventional medicine now that really need to be cleaned up. And I hasten to add, we're not talking about emergency medicine, which is absolutely without parallel brilliant. If I get run over by a truck on the way out here, I want modern medicine, high-tech medicine to put me back together again. But for most chronic illnesses, medicine isn't doing a very good job of curing. And so people are walking with their feet, they're looking to alternatives, and they're also wanting to live more natural lifestyles. They're wanting to have organic food. They're wanting to, live healthy lives. And so they're looking to alternatives. And the other issue here is, of course, there are thousands of studies demonstrating that many forms of alternative medicine or natural health care work. And they are being disregarded by this small but vocal group.
And we never really get to hear about these other side of things. You've made some very, very strong statements, but I know as, being trained as a conventional doctor, every single week our tutor would take us through something called numbers needed to treat. And people don't realise that these figures now exist, that you need to treat sometimes hundreds of people just to get benefit in one person. That means hundreds of people have to take a drug every single day. And what's worse is that, 1 in 10, for example, 1 in 10 people, this is the actual official figures, 1 in 10 people who get a statin after a cardiovascular event like a heart attack or something, if they're treated, they may get muscle damage, whereas 1 in 83 may be helped and have their life saved. So I think what you're doing, what you're really saying is, in your magazine, you're highlighting simply the things that people don't often get to hear about. And I'm always surprised that people don't know things like numbers needed to treat, or that evidence-based medicine, as you say, isn't actually helping that, is showing that we're not actually helping that many people with conventional care, really.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we're just trying to make, medicine is a private conversation now.
Yeah.
You know this because you're a doctor.
Yes.
And it's in all of the medical literature, medicine's failings, and the areas that need to be re-examined, the drugs that don't work, the information that's been massaged. But this information oftentimes doesn't reach the public. So that's what we're trying to do. We're always trying to make that private conversation public.
Exactly, yes, you're right. It's a private conversation. So really what you're doing is you're just taking things that actually are in the public domain. If people want to look for it, they're in official reports, they're in official stats, and you're putting it into a form that people can easily access.
Absolutely. So we're on the one hand looking at what really works in medicine and what people have to ask questions about. And then on the other hand, we're trying to look at, in a very systematic and evidence-based way, what's the evidence for alternative medicine? And what other alternatives do people have? And what are safer ways of tackling problems?
I used to tell my patients, try Tai Chi for hypertension, because that's got a lot of evidence behind it. But doctors aren't encouraged to tell their patients about this, even if it has got the evidence, because it's a lot cheaper.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think these are issues we really have to raise, because Here we have in Britain, you know, the National Health Service is just absolutely overwhelmed. And doctors really, by trying to suppress these natural health cares, you know, and these alternatives, the media, the government, the status quo are going to absolutely, you know, overwhelm the national health even further.
Yes, right. Okay, well, I think we're going to go for a break now. So we'll join us after the break with our next guest. Thank you. Hi, welcome back. My next guest is Brian Hubbard, who has a long history in publishing. He's worked for the Financial Times Group, EMAC Publishing, and more, many more. With his wife Lynn, he's actually the co-publisher of the health journal What Doctors Don't Tell You. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Thank you, Manjir.
So you've had a long history of publishing, so you know the sort of things that journalists are supposed to do in reporting certain issues.
Yes.
So what's been your take on the sort of balance or imbalance of what's been going on?
Well, I did come from a specialist press, which was the Financial Times, and that always did try to balance stories because there was often a lot of money at stake, so it was important that they did so. But unfortunately, since I left sort of mainstream publishing, I suppose, I think I've seen standards drop quite dramatically over the years as increasing pressure on newspapers to sell copies, you know, in face of the web and other outlets. And increasingly they look for controversy rather than fact. And I think that really brought home to me, really, the way we were treated. And of course, the fact that this has been in the media for a long time now about phone tapping and all the dreadful things that journalists have been up to. And we got a little bit of taste of this just a month ago. And, you know, the things they said about us just weren't true. And, you know, there's an old phrase, traducing, where you use lies to destroy someone's reputation. That's pretty much what they tried to do to us and made claims about us which just weren't true. And unfortunately, there seems to be no way around this. There's no argument you could put up to change that view. They were determined to do this, and it was one point of view they were determined to get across. I mean, for example, with the first story, and as Lynn said, they didn't even contact us other than our accounts department, and no one ever gets any change out of them. So we were told that, rather, the British public were told that we were opposed to the MMR vaccine. The British public were told that we believed homeopathy cures cancer. The British public were told that we believed vitamin C cures AIDS. Well, none of these statements actually is true. In the first place, we are researchers and we are journalists, and it's our job to find the stuff that isn't getting into the media so that people can make informed decisions. Now, for example, with homeopathy, what we did discover is that it is regularly used in India for treating cancer. It's the third major form of medicine after conventional Ayurvedic. Homeopathy is regularly used and has been since before the time of Gandhi. And they were getting some really interesting results, so much so that the National Cancer Institute of America got so interested in this that they actually conducted their own trials back in laboratories and found that cell lines of cancer were being destroyed by these homeopathic remedies that they were using back in India. That's what we actually reported. We didn't say from that homeopathy cures cancer, but I think what we were implying is that as we are losing the war against cancer, maybe we need to open the debate a little bit further. Similarly with HIV, vitamin C was again a cell line laboratory test which killed the AIDS virus in that condition. And also I think it helped to reverse it for about 2 years in sufferers. Again, we weren't saying it cures, we were saying maybe it's time we looked at this and opened the debate up.
I think for people who are scientifically curious, curious, to see what you've reported on, because it's not you yourselves saying homeopathy cures cancer. What you're doing is you're reporting. I read the article myself. Very different to how it's been talked about.
Wasn't it just?
Very different.
Yes.
So for me, it was so interesting as someone who is scientifically curious to think, wow, these doctors in India, in Calcutta, which is where my family are from,
Yes, okay.
and they're actually looking at, homeopathy and cancer.
Yes.
And isn't it interesting how the American government are actually thinking it's promising enough to get involved?
Yeah.
And so the article for me was just a reporting on that story.
Yeah.
It wasn't you yourself sort of saying things. I think what could be happening, therefore, is because you're actually, bringing to the public things that people obviously don't want out in public. It is being misreported. Yeah. It's been just quite amazing in terms of this sort of actual what's been said.
Well, what it was. I mean, that was open season. Because what happened then, because the media hunting in packs, this was followed up by Matthew Wright and his radio, BBC, what was it? Channel 5 show.
Channel 5 show, right.
We were on LBC and so on. And
were you actually personally on LBC?
No. We got an email at 7 a.m. on the morning of the Right Stuff, or whatever the show is called, saying we're going to broadcast at 9, be on or face the consequences. Gosh. Well, I mean, we don't get in till 9, so that was too late for us. So we never got the right of reply. Right. We never got the right of reply with the LBC. And Matthew Wright stuck a picture up of Lynn saying this woman is killing people.
Oh, gosh.
And I think, this is, and as you say, you read the article, which was actually open-minded, trying to widen the debate, and I think was very responsible. But no, you wouldn't guess that.
No.
And it was an absolute witch hunt that took place. And I think it was an enormous discredit to the British media that this just spread like wildfire.
Wow. Gosh,
and I mean, fortunately, increasingly people are more sophisticated now. And with the many outlets now available to them, that they do read more and more between the lines than once they did. So, and that's been the saving grace.
Well, I thought it's quite a sophisticated magazine in that it is actually putting together, putting the different things forward and asking the public to make up their own mind, just reporting on things. And but actually saying that you kill people.
Yes. Well, one website said that especially, and we actually called the journalist in who pulled it down immediately and did a more sober story, having actually interviewed us and realised we didn't have horns and that we are reasonable people who just actually care more about the patient than we do about maintaining a paradigm or an industry group.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I'm not a homeopath, or I'm not involved in any of these therapies, but for me, for a true scientific mind, it's interesting. You actually want to.
I mean, personally, I'm not a fan of homeopathy myself, but nonetheless, it was fascinating what I discovered. There was a lot of science there, which surprised me as a researcher. And I thought, people need to read this.
So you've actually looked into the science of how I think it's the mechanisms, isn't it, that really worry people at times.
Yeah, and I just think I think it's just the conceit that science as it stands has all the answers, and that medicine is a science, and therefore will sort out all our ills. And clearly, this is not working.
Yeah.
This is a flawed vision.
Yeah. So you've gone into, I think both of you have actually looked into the actual change in the scientific paradigm itself, haven't you?
Yes, we have.
Yeah.
We have, and I think this is the great flaw of all, is that medicine enjoys an extraordinary position, a privileged position in our society, where it is the most powerful lobby group in the world, where it seems to pretty much control the media, and take my word for that. And it does so because it pronounces itself a science. Now, overall, we look at pretty much all the research. It's fair to say that it works for some of the people some of the time. At best, we're talking about a percentage or 2 point above placebo, roughly 30%. Now, 30% is not a science. Actually, 30% isn't even chance.
And we're not talking about all the papers that have been repressed.
Well, that's right. I mean, because this is the other thing. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about this in a moment. But it's highly selective in what it publishes, and that which is published is also been spun to a degree that even the original researchers can't recognise it.
Right, right. So, okay, so really what we're talking about is the fact that you have been really misquoted. If
Yes.
people actually read your magazine and your
Yes.
publications, they'll actually see that you're actually reporting on things. You're not telling people what to do.
Yes.
And you're reporting on things that really is out in the public
Yeah,
anyway.
you know, our distributor, who were first approached by Sense About Science, said, you know, it just requires someone to pick up a copy and read it and make up their own mind, and they'll find it is responsible, well researched, and actually interesting.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, thank you very much. We're going to have to go for a break now, so do join us after the break when we'll be speaking with Dr. Robert Verkerk. Welcome back. My next guest is Dr. Robert Verkerk, and he's an internationally acclaimed expert in agricultural, environmental and health sustainability. He has a master's degree and a PhD from Imperial College right here in London, and in 2002 he founded the Alliance for Natural Health International, which has become one of the leading not-for-profit campaign organisations working globally to promote more sustainable healthcare systems. He's authored over 60 scientific papers and contributes regularly to magazines including What Doctors Don't Tell You. So welcome to the show, Dr. Robert.
Manjir, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. Now, you're actually the scientific director and the founder of the Alliance of Natural Health. Could you tell us what that is and what you actually do?
Well, essentially, we are a research, information and communication organisation that looks at the entire scape of healthcare, looking at the food supply through to how we manage our health, obviously with a very big focus on the existing healthcare system, but also the so-called complementary and alternative medicine side of things, in order that we can try and find solutions that work for society. We've got our backs up against the wall at the moment with a chronic disease epidemic, which we've heard from Lynn and Brian, we are failing to deal with using conventional healthcare systems. And in order to understand why this situation, why this status quo exists, we have to use a lens of science, because science has become this new form of
Sort of
religion, yes, it's something that we like to worship. And of course, what we see is a huge amount of manipulated and bad science out there that justifies the status quo. And as Lynn has told us already, Western medicine, as we currently know it, is one of the biggest killers in society. A hospital is one of the most dangerous places to visit. And yet the medical system, the orthodoxy, maintains this notion that even for chronic diseases, we should prescribe pills that plainly don't work. And what's fascinating is we are seeing this sea change by major leaders. We've heard about Peter Gersh, for example. We've also seen here in the UK Dr Malhotra, an NHS doctor who's been very outspoken on the issues of the lies we've been fed about our diets. The reality is, until people understand that the way we look after ourselves, the way we feed ourselves, the kind of foods that are being delivered to us in supermarkets, combined with sedentary lifestyles, combined with a system that just creates such a huge amount of psychological and emotional stress, that system together is killing us.
It's killing us, yeah.
So we've got to get away from this notion that we can take an individual pill to try and resolve what is a very complex disease.
So really what we're talking about is you're really highlighting the fact that it's not just about just taking this pill. You've got to look at the soil, as it were. So, you know, how clear are you as a body, you know, with all these environmental toxins that are going on, the stress that you mentioned, and you're looking at the evidence of how clean your food has to be. You know, as a medical doctor, in the whole 5 years of training, I got 2 hours on the subject of nutrition.
Well, you're lucky, because I've heard of people who are even less than that. And of course, what mainstream medicine has done is basically delegate that responsibility to a group of people that we refer to as dietitians. And dietitians are basically taught a very old style of nutrition that has no relevance to any of the emerging science that we know about today. So you can maintain a system that carries on giving people over 50 statins for no advantage at all, and in fact generate a range of additional health problems.
We talked about the problems with statins just earlier. So yes, the form of diet that people generally prescribe in the medical system is very different from the sort of diet that people talk about. For example, they recommend a lot of dairy to get their calcium, where a naturopath would say maybe try a vegan diet. Definitely when I was working as a holistic doctor at the Bristol Cancer Help Centre, we got everybody onto vegan diets as much as possible because there's some evidence. What's the actual science behind this though? I mean, what sort of studies are done to show that a good diet, a clean diet is actually going to help you, or a clean environment?
Well, one of the difficulties is what science do we value when we make these kinds of decisions? And actually the construct that we deal with is actually largely being built by the pharmaceutical industry. So they've created what we know as now the familiar hierarchy of evidence. And at the top of that hierarchy are randomized controlled trials or meta-analyses or systematic reviews of those randomized controlled trials.
So should we just explain what those are?
Yeah, these are basically studies where you take a control group to which you don't administer a type of treatment. You then take a treatment group to which you do. They lend themselves very nicely to, if you like, new to nature compounds like pharmaceuticals, because you can simply give these additional products to the treatment group and then you compare the difference. And
so you're comparing against like a placebo,
yes.
Basically.
Now, as soon as you deal with nutrition, you've got a problem because the issues become confounded. You can't, for example, decide in your control group that you're not going to give them any vitamin A or vitamin B1 or B2 because they simply won't survive. So the reality is when you get to complex studies on nutrition, you often have to look at population-wide studies that we refer to as epidemiological studies. And actually there is some very, very robust evidence that suggests that people who follow particular types of diets, and the results are very powerful for, say, the Mediterranean diet. They're also powerful for certain types of Oriental diets, the Japanese diet, for example, even if there are problems with, say, additional levels of heavy metal. And, you know, that kind of notion has to a degree dripped into parts of the mainstream medical system, but it's often something that's just given in passing because the primary treatment remains the patented medicine. And the reality is, until we see a change in terms of how that observational data runs, and of course there are also a number of factors that work against that. The drug companies, when they saw how powerful the diet was in these epidemiological studies, they said, hey, we will make medicines made out of these ingredients. So they produced synthetic vitamin E, synthetic beta-carotene, gave them to people, did very large studies, and basically found that the nutrients, when they're delivered in high doses in their isolated form outside of the food matrix, doesn't work. And of course, nature is pretty complicated. We now have enough science around to understand exactly why it wasn't working. But what's happened is it's caused a lot of epidemiologists and scientists and medical doctors to say, look, nutrition doesn't play much of a role. And of course, what they've started to do now is say, hey, well, there's something else. There's this thing called exercise. Now let's look at exercise. And exercise is flavour of the month.
Because I know that, you know, when you look at the epidemiology, which is a sort of study of populations and things, that community and a sense of belonging to a community plays a big part in illness as well, whether or not people get sick.
Psychosocial factors are absolutely massive, and if you look at some of the work that's going on now in integrated cancer, it is very interesting how important looking at those sort of psychosocial pressures are. And of course, within this modern society where people have huge amount of pressures and financial pressures and relationship issues.
Doctors really don't have time. I mean, you know, when you've got 7 minutes with the patient, the quickest thing to do is to, you know, you're thinking about how to get onto the next patient who's, you know, the waiting list outside, and you just want to do some sort of intervention of some sort, and to start talking about lifestyle is very, very difficult. So what do you say to doctors?
Well, I believe fundamentally that what we need to see is a complete sea change in the way in which the medical education functions. If you are basically taught to prescribe drugs, that ends up being what you do. And if there are financial incentives involved, that is another reason you do it. And another very important issue is how particular professions are regulated. So, for example, in the UK, if you decide that you don't want to give someone who is suffering from hypertension, you know, a blood pressure medication, for example, and you want to get them to meditate and to eat a different diet.
Which are proven therapies.
Which are proven therapies, but if they don't fit with the NICE guidelines, for example, you actually suffer a risk that the GMC may come down on you. I'm
going to stop you there on that point. We'll come back to that in a second because we're going to have to go to a break. So join us again when we'll be speaking more on What Doctors Don't Tell You. Welcome back. So I was speaking before the break with Dr. Robert Vickert, and you were telling me a bit about the sort of paradigm that the pharmaceutical industry has in terms of evaluating things. Can you say a bit more about what the issues are and what we might need to move
well, of
to?
course, the pharmaceutical industry is a term we use for people who make drugs, and drugs are basically licensed products that are designed to be used for a particular indication. And it involves some very, very large companies and also some quite progressive emerging companies. So let's be clear, you can't basically tar everyone with the same brush. One of the real issues is that a very small number of extremely large companies have dominated the market with patented drugs. And these patents, depending on what part of the world you're in, last 15, 17 years, for example. And most of the blockbuster drugs that have created the really big revenues for these small group of oligopolies are now in some difficulty. They have created constructs of, if you like, mythologies about the importance of cholesterol, hiding some of the fact, you know, creating a very simplistic message that is nearly always scientifically incorrect.
And that's from their own figures. We've got to emphasise that. That's from their own figures and the official numbers needed to treat and all that sort of thing.
And they've also worked very closely with the food industry and with governments to create a situation that keeps people sick. So, for example, the whole notion of the low-fat diet worked very nicely for pharma on one hand to try and create this idea that all fats were bad. That caused the food industry to say, hey, we'll reduce fats, we'll tell the consumer about this. We won't tell them that we'll pump the food full of sugar, and we'll really find ways of making them chronically ill by making them inflamed.
Diabetes as
exactly.
a problem. Yes.
And these bubbles are now are starting to pop. As well as that, of course, the pharma industry is at this place that we call the patent cliff, because their blockbuster drugs are coming to an end, and they're finding it harder and harder to find new chemistries, because the entire business model is based on creating a new to nature molecule that hasn't been seen. One of the reasons that drugs are so toxic to us is because they haven't been seen in nature before. And while we hear the drug companies are on one hand saying, you've got to watch out for all these natural products, the difference is we have evolved very specific enzyme systems and detoxification systems, for example, to deal with the toxins within cabbages, for example.
Right.
and many other plants. So
But when
we're
it comes
quite
to the
well adapted.
artificial products, we're not so much. So really, we're seeing actually the ending of a paradigm within the pharma industry. They seem to be getting more and more. When I speak to people from that industry, there seems to be more of a desperation that's happening. But part of that desperation, I guess, Lynn, you've talked a lot, haven't you, in your book, The Field, and the courses that you ran from that as well. In fact, the whole scientific paradigm is changing, not just the medical paradigm with the advent of quantum theory, and the doctors just deal with as low as a molecule. That's the lowest size of anything they'll deal with. But there's a lot more going on in science than that, isn't there?
Well, I think one of the things we have to understand about science is that it's always changing. You know, we think of it as a static story where we found certain things out and they remain the case. But science is just a story with new evolving chapters, and each chapter rewrites the stuff that's happened before. And the newest chapter has looked at us and looked at all of science as something very different from the world as machine paradigm that we've basically grown up with, and body as machine. And we've grown up with, and medicine is based on the idea that we are essentially a bit of chemistry and electrical signaling. And the new information coming to the fore from quantum physics, from epigenetics, are demonstrating firstly that we are actually creatures of frequencies, that our molecules have conversations with other molecules and have chemical reactions via frequencies, that our bodies via DNA talk to itself through frequency, that epigenetics, the environmental factors, that genes are essentially like the keys of a piano. They sit there in silence until the outside factors, environmental factors, affect them and play them.
And this is mainstream biologists saying this.
This is mainstream everything
Yes,
saying
exactly.
this. You know, the physicists and biologists and all of them are basically saying that we're connected and indivisible from our world. We're an intergalactic superorganism, essentially. And so we can only understand health by also looking at the water we drink, the air we breathe, the food we eat, the friends we have, you know, the sum total of how we live our lives. That determines what genes get played, that determines how healthy we are. So we're much more of a dynamical, holistic model. So that's why drugs, this wreaks havoc with drug trials, because drugs are all about tab A slotting into slot B. But if you're a dynamical, holistic system, that tab A also slots into slot B, C, D, F, and so on. And that's why we have so many side
effects.
effects.
It's not a physical anything anyway, is it? When it comes down to it, our very atoms are just simply information.
Exactly. They're vibrating packets of energy, trading energy with other vibrating packets of energy. So one of the problems is the entire paradigm is too simplistic.
So Brian, it's really a case of whose paradigm is it anyway, isn't it?
It is, and at the moment it's a case of almost a clash of paradigms, and we're seeing the end days of that, I believe, because otherwise the assault upon the new paradigm would not be so intense as we're seeing it now. And as we said earlier, we're seeing it through the press, we're seeing it in government, we're seeing it in the way that we are supposed to think about things. But unfortunately, it's all sneaking out, isn't it? They just can't keep a lid on it. Thank goodness, because of things like the web, because of wonderful programs like yours, that this information is getting out. And of course, magazines like ours and the work that Rob is doing. And despite their best efforts, we won Health Site of the Year. www.wddty.com won Health Website of the Year. It knocked into touch National Health Service, NetDoctor, and all the others who are pushing the current
and that was
view.
The people's choice.
This was the people's choice.
The people's choice
and
and the people's
isn't that
choice.
marvellous? And that's really how, I don't like to see it as a battle, but it is this shift that is occurring and will inevitably occur. And they will not stop this from happening. It's a movement because it's about freedom of speech, it's about freedom of choice, it's about people being their own masters and making their own decisions. And that will never, ever be stopped.
Fantastic. So really this is a message of hope. The very fact that they are closing in, like in a type of McCarthyism, you were saying, Ellie, you know, is actually a message of hope, because if it wasn't getting out there so much and people weren't sort of waking up to making their own choices, they wouldn't be trying to clamp down so much, really.
Yeah, it is a message of enormous hope. Everything we're saying today is actually about hope, but it is really important that people don't fall asleep. They don't just follow the line. They have to explore, find out, and become, you know, a sovereign human being. And that should never be stopped. But people have to be awake to that.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Any last thoughts, Dr. Robert?
Well, I think what we're seeing is this division between a certain group of person that fundamentally has a belief system that feels that there is something inferior about a natural system, something dirty, something unclean, and human technology can rise above it and control it. And I think genetically modified crops, another issue that we're very involved with, and I know you are too, absolutely quintessentially deals with this issue, where it's felt by the pro-GM lobby it's okay to take DNA from an unrelated species. Right. On the other hand, if you start to understand more about the fabric of life, you realize if you want success and results in healthcare, actually it's not about going backwards, it's about going forward and welcoming, embracing your role as a living entity.
Fantastic, thank you. And where do people go for more information?
They can come to our website, www.wddty.com. They can subscribe to us via wddtysubscribe.com.
Your subscriptions have gone up, haven't they?
They have gone wildly upward. Again, the more we've been suppressed, the stronger we've become.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming today, all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you very much for joining us today with a topic which desperately needed to have the other side heard. Join us next time on Hidden Science for some more science from the cutting edge. Thank you and goodbye.